If you're into thrilling, dramatic stories with shocking historical twists, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Let's dive into another mystery of the past. In 16th century Spain, the birth of Don Carlos was seen as a monumental event filled with hopes and expectations. He was the heir to one of the greatest empires in the world, the son of the ruthless Philip II, the King of Spain. Before he even opened his eyes, Don Carlos already bore the weight of a grand destiny. He would be the next ruler, destined to follow in his father's footsteps, governing vast territories from the Americas to the Philippines. It was impossible to imagine that the boy who sparked so much enthusiasm and celebration in the Spanish courts was, in fact, the embryo of a tragedy. The court was in celebration. The nobles gathered, their ornate garments and faces lit up with the hope that, at last, the empire's future was secured. Prince Don Carlos, the son of royalty, would be the man to inherit everything. The honor, the power, and the glory. The kingdom, its fame, its fortune, all would be his. His eyes had barely opened, and already people spoke of his greatness. However, there was a dark truth, a reality that the courtiers and even his parents did not fully understand. Don Carlos' future was destined to be filled with suffering. More than a princely heir, he would become a prisoner, not of physical chains, but of a lineage that was already doomed by its own choices. Philip II, still young, saw his son as the pinnacle of his dynasty. Don Carlos was not just the heir to a kingdom, but the symbol of a bloodline purified by the obsession to keep royal blood untarnished. In his father's mind, he was the perfect extension of the empire that Philip II ruled with an iron fist. But in a world where the image of perfection and symmetry was seen as a reflection of divine favor, Don Carlos' faith was beginning to be cruelly and inevitably shaped. What should have been a promise of greatness would become a story of decline, a tale of love and hate between father and son. Before even taking his first breath, Don Carlos was already trapped, not by chains, but by an inheritance that condemned him. The kingdom was celebrating the birth of a perfect prince, but what no one knew was that this prince already carried in his body the invisible flaws of past generations. He was the product of a bloodline so obsessed with purity, so fixated on keeping royalty within its own veins, that this obsession had turned into poison. Don Carlos' nightmare was not just a matter of luck or fate, it was mathematical. A genetic roulette where the Habsburgs had played their cards to the last cycle, and, contrary to what many imagined, Carlos had already lost this bet before he was even born. The concept of purity within the Habsburg dynasty was a deadly burden. He had only 6 great-great-grandparents, 6, while an average person would have 16. This was the consequence of generations of consanguineous marriages, of uncles marrying nieces, of cousins uniting to keep royal blood pure. What the court celebrated as a miracle, science already knew to be a sentence. This miracle of a prince born into a lineage of kings and emperors was nothing more than an illusion. The doctors and physicians of the time knew, but could not say, that this boy was already condemned. Carlos was not just a prince, but the reflection of the failure of generations who prioritized lineage over health. Upon birth, Carlos' physical deformity was one of the first signs that the price of genetic purity had been paid. His head, more deformed than any normal baby's, his labored breathing, and his extreme fragility were clear signs of what was to come. But he was a prince, and as a prince, he was to be treated as such. When Carlos' mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, died shortly after giving birth, a victim of an infection, at just 17 years old, the young prince was left orphaned and, worse, heir to a genetic curse. His mother died at the moment when he could barely understand the world around him, and the loss of his mother, a personal and irrevocable tragedy, was the first of many burdens he would have to bear. The true weight of his genetic inheritance, however, was something that Don Carlos could not see. The consequences of generations of inbreeding had done more harm than he could ever comprehend, and unknowingly, he was already at the center of a deadly game that had begun long before his birth. The death of Maria Manuela, Don Carlos' mother, was a devastating blow to the young prince. She passed away just 4 days after childbirth, a victim of a brutal infection. For Don Carlos, who had barely begun to adjust to his new life, the loss of his mother was an irrevocable tragedy, something he could never fully comprehend. He was placed in an impossible position, where the maternal figure that should have guided and protected him was ripped away, before he had a chance to know her. While the court rejoiced at the arrival of an heir, Don Carlos' fate was already sealed. He would never experience the love of a mother, and even worse, the burden he carried, the royal blood, did not bring with it just greatness and privilege, but also the curse of a doomed lineage. The absence of his mother created a void that could never be filled. The pain of growing up without this essential figure in his life would be a shadow that hung over him, shaping a melancholic and angry character, an anger he could barely understand. The impact of this loss was profound. It wasn't just the death of a young mother that left a hole in the prince's life, but the sense of abandonment. The child, who should have been nurtured and filled with love, was cast into a cold and impersonal world where love was replaced by state duties. His early moments in life, which should have been filled with affection and care, were marked by loneliness. Maria's death wasn't just a personal tragedy for Carlos, but also a dynastic tragedy as he grew up without the emotional support of his mother, leaving deep marks on his psyche. And yet, the court did not stop. The servants continued to serve, the dances continued, and the prince, with his innocent eyes, was just another symbol of the empire, a symbol that carried the weight of an uncertain fate. Don Carlos was trapped between the weight of his parents' legacy and the pain of losing his mother. And as time passed, he began to become aware of the loneliness that surrounded him. As Don Carlos grew, what initially seemed like a promise of greatness began to transform into a personal nightmare. Slowly, he started to realize that his place in the empire, his inheritance, did not protect him from the depths of loneliness and frustration. The first signs of his growing rift with his father emerged in his adolescence, when the tension between them began to intensify. Philip II, the ruthless king of Spain, was the epitome of authority and duty. For him, the kingdom always came first, even above his own family. The relationship between him and Don Carlos was marked by rigid formality, where a father's love was overshadowed by the weight of royal duty. While the young prince yearned for more than just his father's authority, Philip II viewed love and affection as weaknesses, beliefs that could not be tolerated when the kingdom was at stake. Every interaction between them seemed to be a silent struggle, where paternal love was constantly pushed aside by the coldness of politics and empire. Philip's emotional detachment was devastating for Don Carlos, who, despite being surrounded by wealth and privileges, felt the absence of what he needed most, his father's affection. He saw himself trapped in a role he never wanted. The prince, who should have been a symbol of power, felt increasingly powerless within the walls of a palace where doors were closed to love and opened only to duty. His frustration slowly turned into something darker. It was a silent revolt, but one that was steadily growing, against the man who should have been his greatest protector, but who had become his greatest oppressor. Don Carlos' anger was a silent flame that began to consume everything around him. He felt the oppression of his father's kingdom, but still, he couldn't escape it. His mind, so full of a desire for freedom and a life beyond the crown, was becoming a battlefield within himself. This revolt, fueled by loneliness and a lack of love, began to define the prince he was destined to become. King Philip II's dilemma between his duty as a king and his love as a father was never more apparent than in that crucial moment when he faced an impossible choice. The empire needed a strong heir, someone capable of maintaining Spain's greatness, someone who could continue the legacy of power and control that Philip so cherished. But his son, Don Carlos, with his deformed body, increasingly unstable mind, and a personality marked by trauma and anger, seemed incapable of leading. Philip II, despite being a father, was first and foremost a king. The empire was at stake, and the line of succession needed to be protected at any cost. What appeared to be a simple question, to love his son or to secure the empire, became an unbearable psychological torment. He saw Don Carlos suffering, but he also knew that if he allowed his son to become king, the empire could crumble. The health of the kingdom, political stability, the maintenance of power, these were the factors that Philip II could not ignore. He saw that the boy he had sired, the son of his own flesh and blood, was becoming a threat to the throne. The pain of making this decision was deep. Philip II tried, for a time, to reconcile his love for his son with his responsibility as a monarch. He attempted to offer comfort, to find solutions for Don Carlos' situation, but the political reality was relentless. While the prince sank deeper into his own madness, Philip knew that the only way to ensure the empire's stability would be to remove his son from any chance of ascending to the throne. Philip II's decision was not made easily. It was a choice that tore his heart, but his loyalty to the empire, to the crown, was stronger. Don Carlos, on the other hand, began to perceive the coldness of his father. He felt the rejection, the growing distance, and this realization only fueled his anger. Philip II knew this, but his decision was made. A father's love was eclipsed by the shadow of royal duty. The future of Spain could not be risked by a prince so deeply disturbed. Philip II chose the empire, sacrificing his own son to preserve what he believed was the only true duty of a king, to keep the kingdom safe no matter the cost. The tragedy of Don Carlos did not end with his death. In fact, it was only the beginning of a meticulous attempt to erase his existence from the memory of history. His father, Philip II, had made a painful decision by locking his son away in prison at the end of his life, but that was not enough for the monarch. The King of Spain didn't just sacrifice the future of his own son, he also made sure to eliminate any trace of Don Carlos' life, as if he wanted to erase the mistake of bringing him into the world. When Don Carlos died in 1568 at the age of 23, the news of his death was met with deafening silence. The prince's body was buried quickly, without ceremonies, without a funeral worthy of a royal heir. His tomb bore no more than his name and the date of his birth and death, a final attempt to keep his memory erased. But Philip II's actions didn't stop there. The portraits of Don Carlos were removed from the palace walls, his personal belongings were destroyed, and his letters were burned. It was as though he had never existed. The prince who could have been king was erased from all official documentation. his contributions and his life forgotten as if they had never happened. Philip II's attempt to eradicate the memory of Don Carlos was meticulous, but as often happens, history cannot be fully controlled. Despite Philip's tireless efforts, Don Carlos resurfaced, though not as the prince he truly was. The dark, deformed man, tormented by his own mind and his genetic heritage, was transformed by playwrights and composers into a figure of romantic tragedy. Friedrich Schiller, the famous German playwright, took fragments of Carlos' story and, in his play, turned the cruel prince into a romantic hero crushed by tyranny. Giuseppe Verdi's opera, which later adapted this story, made the prince appear noble and destined for a tragic fate. The real Don Carlos, the boy destroyed by his own lineage, was forgotten by official history. But his fictional version, as a martyr, became immortal. His pains and suffering transformed into a story of love and loss. Philip II may have won the battle for the throne, but his victory over Don Carlos' legacy did not last. History, just like the prince's memory, refused to disappear. The true Don Carlos was silenced, but the narrative he left behind, that of a man broken by his own blood and the coldness of his father, continues to be told to this day. Did you enjoy the video? Then give us a thumbs up and share this story with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. See you in the next video, where we'll reveal more secrets and tragedies from history.